So as I mentioned before, this is not a CSS or a design course. We just need to focus on WordPress functionality. So I've written some CSS here, as you can see, organized into some folders. So I just want to talk about this organization a little bit in this course. And of course it's up to you if you want to follow my structure or not. I just felt like I need to talk about my CSS structure and naming conventions. So you can get these SAS folders from the repository and copy them and just compile in order to save some time. So the CSS architecture I use for this project is called the IT CSS, or the inverted triangle CSS. And the idea is to divide your CSS into these layers here, where the higher layer will be the most generic and will have the lowest specificity, and as we go down our styles will become more explicit and will have higher specificity. So you can read more about that. I won't go into more details, but let's just break down these layers and see what each one of these will contain. So we have the settings layer, and this will contain our SAS variables, the global SAS variables that we will use throughout all of our SAS files, like the fonts and colors and stuff like that. The second layer is tools, and this will be also SAS functions or mixins that we will use throughout our SAS files. And the generic layer, and this one will contain very generic CSS, like normalizing CSS across browsers, or CSS resets, or just general global rules. And then we have the elements layer, and this one is for bare unclassed HTML elements, like the h1 tag without any class, or the p tag without any class. How would that look like? And then the object, and this is for styling non-cosmetic design patterns, like layouts and grids. It does not deal with specific styles for a component, just a skeleton or a layout. And then we have the components, and this is where we get very specific and start styling pieces of UI, like a widget or a header or a photo, stuff like that. And then finally trumps, and these are layers with the highest specificity. You can use important with that to override any other style that the element has. So for example, text center would force the text align to be center using important. So this layer have the highest specificity, and it comes last in our pyramid. So I just wanted to summarize these layers here, but you can read more about it. There's a lot more to read here in this article. I will put a link in the lecture links. I also use the BEM naming convention for CSS. You might have heard about this, but if not, I will put a link to this article. And I also use what is referred to as namespacing. So I will also put a link to this article, but to summarize, namespacing is just prefixing your CSS classes with some symbols in order to signify what type of an element it is. So we just mentioned that we have our layers here, and we said we have objects and components and trumps. So these will translate to certain namespaces for our CSS classes. So for example, O- before the CSS class name will signify that this is an object, and C- a component, and U- a utility class, which are trumps in our case, and so on. So if you see that in my code, just refer to this article. Also, we have if you go to codex.wordpress.org/css, you'll find some bits of CSS here that you should include in your theme. So when you create a post, and let's say you have an image and you align this image to left or right, WordPress will generate a class in your front end, align right, align left, align center, and so on. And these are not styled by default. You should add these classes in your style sheets. So WordPress provides you these styles here that you can use in your theme or modify. So I did that, and I will show you in code. In fact, we can do this now. So let's see how all what we've discussed will translate in code. So we have our folders here, and each one of these folders represent a layer. So we have the components, we can view one of these like the post component. So we have c-post because it's a component, and we have the BEM naming convention here, as you can see, the __. So we also have the elements, which we mentioned will be just plain HTML elements without any styles. So we have the buttons and the inputs and so on. We also have the generic. The generic layer is the most generic CSS. So if we have CSS that targets all elements, like the asterisks, and also the normalization. So here I installed normalized CSS using npm install normalized CSS, and then included it from the node modules folder. And in case you don't know, just normalizes the CSS between different browsers, because each browser will have certain default styles. So this library will just make all browsers look the same. And we have the objects. So we have I have my grid system here. Some loops and some variables. And the WP is the file that I just mentioned, this one. I modified some stuff in it. I added the SS mixin that converts pixels to RAMs and stuff like that. And the settings, which was the first layer, that will have some global variables. And the tools, which are global mixins and functions. So I have some functions here that I borrowed from Foundation that converts pixels to RAM, which is really useful. And we have the last layer, which is the trumps. I called it utility here. So I have some classes that will add some margin, and it uses importance, so it will force that margin to be put in the element. And also some helper functions, like remember the screen reader class. Here it is now. And we have some others that we will use later. And also some classes for Flexbox and stuff like that. And then finally in the bundle, I just add these files in order. So the settings first, and then the tools, and then generic and elements and so on. So that was just a summary of how I organize my CSS. You can totally ignore that and use your own implementation. I just needed to talk about how I did it. Let's now change to our theme and run npm run start, and make sure you have your MAM server open. So this is how it looks like now. In the next lecture, we're going to add some classes from the CSS that I just loaded in order to make this look, much better. See you in the next lecture.